And we're back on Veterans Radio, and we've switched seats, and this is Gary Lilly, and we're 45 years ago today. Anybody that was alive remembers what they were doing when they heard that President Kennedy was assassinated. As I mentioned earlier, I worked in a factory, and do you guys remember all the jokes that were going around? It was like every day there'd be a new joke about President Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And I walked back in after lunch, and a guy working on a press said, "Did you hear the president's been shot?" And I broke into a big grin. I was waiting for the punchline. He said, "No, I'm serious. He was shot." And I asked, "Was he killed?" And he said, "We don't know yet." Later on, of course, we learned he was. And the next few days, it was all, the nation mourned. There was an amazing presidential funeral. And this morning we have George Perrault, who was a young Navy enlisted man at that time. He was part of the Honor Guard, serving in the Rotunda. George, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Pleased to be here, Gary.
When you first were named to the Honor Guard, how did that come about?
Well, I'll give you a little background here. My first duty station in the Navy, I'm a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer. I served from 1957 to 1982. I'd like to say hi to all the fellow veterans out there. And a special hello to Al and Barb Wood in Tasmania, Australia. Good day, mate. Colonel Ballentine, if you're still listening, I'm sorry the Navy lost you, but at least you had a good code name, Klondike. It happens to be a Navy ship named the USS Klondike, which was a repair ship, and that was still in commission when you were in Vietnam. My first duty station in the Navy, I was on a oiler tanker named the Salamone, AO-26, and after 5 years at sea, I got orders to the Naval Station, Washington, D.C. And I worked in the supply department. I was a second-class petty officer at the time. I had approximately about 6 years in the Navy by the time I got to Washington.
What is the Army equivalent of a petty officer second class?
E5.
E5, which would be sergeant? Sergeant. Okay.
And at the time, President, all the armed services in Washington have an honor guard. The Army, Navy, Marine, Coast Guard, they all have their separate honor guard. I'm sure you've seen them at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the Arlington cemeteries, the state dinners in the White House, heads of department and heads of state that come to Washington. Each service has their own ceremonial guard, if you might call it that. At the time, President Hoover and General MacArthur were both ill, and they wanted to supplement the ceremonial guard, knowing that there possibly might be two state funerals at the same time. So my name went in, and a fellow sailor in my division, his name went in, and you think nothing of it. Their names went in on a list. And come that Friday afternoon, I got a phone call from my wife that said the president had been assassinated. Our president had been shot, and we dropped everything and we rushed for radio and to listen to some of the details. And then you think nothing of it because my name went in as part of the ceremonial guard, not knowing that would be the President Kennedy. And the shore patrol come and picked us up from our office and or the base police, I believe it was, and off we went. And we went off to the ceremonial guard barracks in Washington, which is right across the way from my work. And we did a little practice. And believe it or not, my fellow division guy and I had, at least we knew some military commands and so forth. But we put a trash can, and the ceremonial guard chief was there, who trains his sailors all the time. So he had to train us. So he put a trash can in the middle of the room. We grabbed broom handles, mop handles, and everything to simulate rifles. And we did a few minutes of practice that the chief said, this is basically how it's going to go. You're going to be on President Kennedy's detail. Here's how it's going to go. Off we went from there. For reasons unknown, we went to a funeral home just down the street from Bethesda Navy Hospital, a place called Gawler's Funeral Home. And a few of us were put in there for reasons we still don't know. And if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember if it was evening or by that time, but all the drapes were drawn in the funeral home, and they tell us not to look outside. Well, that's all you need to do is tell a sailor not to do it. So we looked behind the drapes, and all the press was out there. We could see all the enormous lights and everything. We couldn't figure out what we were doing in the funeral home. So after the funeral home, we just stayed there for a few hours. After the funeral home, we were escorted to the White House. And I might tell you, the first entry into the White House is really something. And we went down in the basement, and there's in the old days, they tell me it was a civil defense bunker, like in the White House. It's all cement. There's racks. If you're familiar with the Navy ships, there were racks 4 high that folded up. That's where the White House police is at now, because I remember seeing all their trophy cases and whatever have you down there. If any mass threat with the White House, that's where all the police would be stationed down there and so forth. So we walked through there, and then they took us to the presidential theater. We were housed in the theater. Then approximately 4:30 in the morning, they brought in President Kennedy from Dallas. They brought in President Kerry from Bethesda. They brought in President Kennedy to the White House. They had a private room for a while. Then he was in the East Room, but then this is Saturday daytime. Then he was in the East Room of the White House.
What were you doing during that time?
We were in the presidential theater just waiting word what to do. So I had a good fortune of standing one watch in the East Room of the White House.
So you did stand watch over the president's casket in the White House.
Right. And that basically was for a lot of the dignitaries. I remember I have pictures of President Eisenhower and a few others and so forth. I suppose a lot of your senators and whatever have you. That was not open to the public in the White House.
Okay.
So the dignitaries were in the White House.
I vaguely remember that.
Then he went from the White House to the Capitol Rotunda, and again I had the I don't know if you'll call it good fortune, but I stood the very first watch when they brought him into the Capitol Rotunda. And I brought some pictures with me, and I know it's going to be hard
to describe them.
Well,
the Capitol Rotunda has a huge room in the middle with a very high domed ceiling.
Right.
And you had brought along a National Geographic, and one of the most famous photographs taken of the president as he was laying in state has 4 servicemen, one from each major branch of the service, standing, about 15 feet off, 20 feet off from each corner.
Right.
And you were the Navy man in that photograph.
Right. All 5 services are represented. We have 4 in each corner, and there was an officer at the head of the casket. And
so the Coast Guard was included.
Yes.
Oh, great.
And the commands are all silent when you're standing there. If the officer at the head of the casket gives the most remote nod of his head, where the guy in the corner can see it. And then we silently count to 3, and then we go to parade rest, and then again back to attention. Then when our relief comes in, it's the same way. It's all done by a very slight nod of the head. Then we change the guard, and we were approximately on a half hour and 2 hours off on the watch.
So you guys did an hour or 2 of practice about that. You basically knew what you were going to do, and you did it. And everybody thought that probably you had been performing this, doing that all your career.
Right.
I remember seeing that, and it was very, very professional.
None of the gentlemen I stood watch with were part of the Navy Ceremonial Guard. For the most part, all the Ceremonial Guard kids are what we call non-rated, E3 and below. They have senior petty officers in charge of the Ceremonial Guard. But all these guys around the casket were guys like me. They got put on the detail unaware of what kind of detail it was going to be with the president.
We've got a little over a minute left in this segment, but one of the things I always wondered about is when you're doing that, your uniform has to be really squared away and your shoes have to be really shiny. Were they already that way, or did you have a little bit of time to prep for it?
We had to work in our service dress uniform at the naval station, our service dress blues. So, needless to say, you had to look good for work every day when you had inspection.
A lot of officers around,
and so forth. Yeah, that's true.
Right.
So off we went. It just
So you were already all set.
It was already all set.
I remember being able to look down and see my reflection in my shoes when I was standing in ranks.
In between these, in between the daytime when we stayed over at Fort Myers, we had no toiletry articles with us for shaving and everything, so that was lent to us by other soldiers over at Fort Myers. We stayed over there and had sack lunches and whatnot over at Fort Myers. And then
we're going to come back to that, George, in the next segment. You're listening to Veterans Radio on Ave Maria Radio, and we'll be right back after these messages. We're back on Veterans Radio. 45 years ago today, President Kennedy was assassinated, and we're talking to George Perrault, who was a Navy honor guard over President Kennedy's casket as he was laying in state in the rotunda. And we've got about 10 minutes to pack in 3 days of funeral. George, you stood guard over the casket in the rotunda. What was the mood in the room? That was when the general public, got to file past and see him.
Having stood the very first watch, I have in front of me a centerfold of one of my magazines, but standing the very first watch, the entire heads of state of the world was basically there, probably except Castro and Khrushchev of Russia. But very, very quiet. You could just hear a pin drop. Even the small children were there. You didn't even hear them fussing and so forth. And looking back at the pictures, I have in front of me Jackie and Caroline when they knelt at the casket, and reviewing all my other pictures, I don't see little John. They were both had almost identical outfits on, and I don't see little John. So maybe he was fussing and had to go home or something. But it's really solemn, so quiet, and to look around and see all these people and try to figure out who's who. Of course, you can't do a lot of head turning and so forth, so we just had to look around. But, President Eisenhower and President Johnson, Jackie herself and Bobby Kennedy, just looking at all these people.
George, there were people. I remember seeing the huge lines that were outside for the people to walk past, and it was a procession of the general public. You'd get in line, and you'd get to walk past the casket. So for the dignitaries, did they have their own place to stand or sit?
No, they're all surrounded in the rotunda. They had the media. Of course, the media wasn't as big back then as it was nowadays. But the media, practically 3/4 of the rotundas in a circle where all the dignitaries and senators and everything were in that rotunda. They were going to not have the rotunda open, I believe it was after midnight, but they estimated the line outside for the public was some 40 city blocks long of people waiting to come in to see, pass by the president. Another thing, when standing watch, the public, when they come through, you see people in crutches, you see soldiers, you see people of the cloth, you see nurses, you see people.
You see America.
Right, you see America of coming in. Just so solemn.
And so it was solemn. You guys were on for an hour, and then you were off you'd get relieved for an hour, or was it 2 hours?
No, we were on a half hour and about 2 hours off.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, how could you stand at attention for a full hour? That's hard on the body. Yeah.
Well, again, the officer at the head of the casket,
sure.
However he timed it at his will, he would give us a nod, we'd go to parade rest.
All right. So when you were off, you'd go to a room and sit there for a break. Is that right?
We were in the old Senate chambers back in the 1800s, right off of the rotunda. One interesting story. I don't have the time to explain how you.
No, you don't have to explain. You were in the room, but I want to hear the story about Ethel Kennedy.
Well, there's a rubber grommet that goes on the bottom of your trousers to make it look like a stovepipe when you're standing up, so you look very military. And when you sit down, in the old Navy 13-button uniform becomes very tight on your stomach. So you undo your 13 buttons when you're sitting down to relax. So I had my 13 buttons down and a few other ones when they're sitting in the old Senate chambers to relax in between watches. And lo and behold, Ethel Kennedy comes in looking for a telephone. Almost every guy in the room just jumps to attention naturally, but, not me and a couple of my buddies because our trousers would have fell down.
With your pants down, right.
Yeah.
I remember we used to do that before big inspections. When you sat down, you'd pull your trousers down so they didn't get wrinkled up, and then you'd redo them when you'd go fall in for inspection. When you went back on, how long were you there? Were you just the rotunda, or were you other parts of the funeral?
Just the rotunda, the White House. Then when we shifted to the rotunda, then after the rotunda, I got dismissed, and the president's casket went to the church, and then on to Arlington. And to this day, Gary, I still can't remember how I got home from the rotunda. I lived, probably 10 miles from the Capitol. I can't remember how I got home.
Because your mind has so many images. I'm watching you as you're talking, and your mind is going back and seeing all those pictures in your mind. So I can understand that.
I think it was the most incredible time in American history up until today when we were watching that as children and as adults. Just the drum sound of the funeral once they left the rotunda, it still sticks in my head as we're looking at these pictures. And I just wanted to remind our audience that Google has signed a deal with Life magazine to show all of their photographs throughout history. And if you can go on Google and type in Life photos, you can get access to all of these photographs, that many of them that George has here, and I think it's amazing what you'll be able to see.
Bob and I were talking at breakfast earlier. The Air Force One is down in Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And I remember what you were talking about. There was a huge delay while they were getting the casket in the plane. And what happened was there was a bulkhead that was in the way. They had to cut the interior bulkhead out of the plane to get the casket in there and make the turn.
With a saw.
With a saw.
I mean, like a...
If you want to see Air Force One that carried the president and where President Johnson was sworn in, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And if you want to see the limousine that President Kennedy was riding in when he was assassinated, it's at the Henry Ford Museum, formerly Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. Back to George. We've got about a minute and a half left. Where did you watch the funeral, George?
At home. You did. At home. I got home just as they were arriving at Arlington, so I watched the rest of it in Arlington. We didn't have color TVs back then. It was all black and white.
That's the thing that sticks in your mind is that all of our televisions were black and white, and so we thought we were watching a newsreel, but it was real. Yeah. It was real time.
I took a day off work of the factory and got chewed out the next day, and I said, "Hey, fire me if you want." I wanted to watch see the president's funeral.
I have a picture in front of me when President Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One, and reading the article. I guess for almost 3 hours we were out without a president because they had to wait for a federal judge to come in and swear in LBJ.
Well, its time has flown past. We've been talking to George Perrault, who was one of the members of the honor guard of President Kennedy when he was assassinated 45 years ago today. George is in possibly the most famous photograph taken from high up in the rotunda looking down. He's the Navy guy in there. If you go to Google Life magazine pictures, you'll see him. And in the meantime, you are dismissed.